My brother blocked me from our mother's funeral and said I wasn't in the will. Then the lawyer pulled out a second envelope. The morning of my mother's funeral, my brother changed the locks on the family home and told me the service was private. He said it standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and the specific expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time to say something and has finally found the occasion for it. He said, "Mom's wishes were clear. You're not in the will. You're not part of this." And then he closed the door in my face. My name is Diane. I am 41 years old. I am a woman who has spent the last 20 years being the quiet one, the one who stayed close, the one who drove our mother to her appointments and learned her medication schedule and sat with her through the nights when the pain was bad and called her every single day without exception for the last 4 years of her life. I am the daughter who was there, and on the morning of her funeral, my brother, who had visited 6 times in 7 years and who had forgotten her birthday twice running and who had once sent a card for Christmas that arrived in February, stood in a doorway and told me I wasn't part of the family. He didn't know about the second envelope. He didn't know our mother had sat with her attorney 4 months before she died and said, "Make sure Diane gets this herself. By hand. In person. Not through Marcus." The attorney's name was Helen Park. She called me the afternoon of the funeral while I was sitting in my car outside the house I had grown up in, which had a new lock on the door. She said she had something for me. She said she needed me to come to her office. She said, "Your mother was very specific about the order of things. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge. If you have ever been erased by the person who was supposed to protect you from exactly that, told you weren't part of something that was built on your back, your time, your presence, you are exactly where you need to be. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe, because this story ends in a room with a conference table and a second envelope and the specific silence of a man who built his entire position on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is where you understand everything that happens after. Let me tell you about Marcus first, because you need to understand him to understand any of this. Marcus is 4 years older than me. He is the kind of person who, from a very young age, understood that presence was negotiable if you were strategic about your absences. He learned early that he could disappear for stretches of time. For school, for work, for the years he spent in another city building a career in commercial real estate. And that when he returned with the particular energy of someone important arriving, someone whose time was valuable and whose appearance was therefore a gift. He had learned to make his intermittent presence feel more significant than my constant one. And my mother, who loved him with the specific helpless ferocity that some mothers reserve for the child who is most like them, ambitious, restless, always oriented toward what's next, had absorbed that lesson and reflected it back. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it with the clarity of someone who has spent a long time looking at a thing from every angle and has arrived at an accurate description of it. My mother loved me. I know she did. But Marcus was the dream she had projected onto a person, and I was the daughter who was there. And those are different things, and they produce different relationships with the same woman. My father died when I was 19. That is the moment everything changed, though I did not understand at the time how much it was changing or in which direction. What happened after he died was simple in its outline. Marcus, who was 23 and living 2 states away and building the early foundations of what would become his career, stayed 2 states away. And I, who had been planning to move, found reasons not to. My mother was not fragile. She was not the kind of woman who broadcasts need, which is its own kind of need, the kind that goes unaddressed because it doesn't announce itself. But I could see her. I had always been able to see her. And what I saw was a woman who had organized her life around 2 people and now had one of them gone and the other one packing. I unpacked. I stayed. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this for approximately 6 years, at which point I acknowledged it had become a different kind of permanent and adjusted my life accordingly. What those 6 years looked like in practice? I finished my degree at a school close enough that I could drive home on weekends. I took my first job in healthcare administration at a hospital 25 minutes from the house I grew up in, which was a practical choice, I told myself, and which was also clearly a proximity choice, the kind of decision you make when you are orienting your life around something you have not explicitly named. I helped with the house. Not because my mother asked, but because the gutters needed cleaning and the porch railing was loose, and I knew how to find someone who could fix it, and my mother would not ask for help with a loose railing before the railing had actually given way. She was like that, capable in a way that produced neglect in the things she could technically manage, and therefore would not flag as needing attention until they couldn't be ignored. I flagged them. I showed up on Saturday mornings and I walked through and I noted things. This is the kind of help that is invisible because it prevents problems rather than solving them, and prevented problems produce no drama. And without drama, there is no story. And without a story, there is no recognition. Marcus knew the house had good gutters. He did not know why. The years between my father's death and my mother's illness, roughly 15 years, had their own texture and rhythm. I had relationships that didn't last long enough, in the way of someone whose life is organized around an obligation she hasn't named out loud, and whose partners eventually notice that they are not the organizing principle. I had a close friendship with a woman named Carol who worked in the same hospital and who became the person I talked to about my mother in the way I couldn't talk to my mother about my mother. I had a life that was genuinely mine and that I do not look back on with regret, only with the recognition that it was shaped by choices I made and that some of those choices narrowed other possibilities, and that this is the nature of choices, and not a tragedy. I am not a woman who deals in tragedy. I find it imprecise. When my mother was diagnosed, the shape of my life changed again, this time more visibly and more completely. The diagnosis was serious from the beginning. The kind of diagnosis that comes with a realistic conversation about trajectory. She handled it with the composure she brought to difficult information, which was to absorb it fully and immediately, and then ask the most practical question available, which in this case was, what do we do first? What we did first was find the right oncologist, which took 3 consultations. I drove to each one. I sat in the appointment and I asked the questions she didn't think to ask, or was too polite to ask, or had already answered for herself and needed confirmed by someone outside her own head. I learned the vocabulary of her specific situation quickly because I have always learned things quickly when the learning mattered. And this mattered. The 11 months of chemotherapy were the most demanding period I had experienced, and also, in a way I will try to describe accurately, the period in which I felt most like myself. I am not saying that grief is a place I prefer to live. I am saying that being needed in a specific way by a person I loved deeply produced a clarity of purpose that I have not often felt with that intensity in other contexts. I knew what I was for. I knew what each day required. I showed up and I did it, and I went home and I did it again. Marcus called. He called every Sunday, which I want to be clear about because this is his version of love and it is real. Whatever else is true. He asked how she was. He listened. He said the right things. He sent gifts that my mother appreciated and mentioned specifically when she described them to her friends, which she did, with genuine warmth. He loved her. The love was present and it was real and it was delivered at a distance and on a schedule that he managed and that she accepted because he was her son and she loved him. And because my mother had a deep and practical ability to receive what people had available to give rather than grieving what they didn't. I did not always share this ability. I am being honest with you. I am not a woman who deals in tragedy. The 24 hours after she died and before Marcus arrived were the last hours of the version of things that had always existed. I handled the calls to the funeral home and to her doctor and to the 2 close friends who needed to hear from a person rather than a notification. I found her important papers in the places she had told me to find them. She had been organized about her dying in the careful way she had been organized about everything, which was one of the many things I had loved about her and will continue to love about her for the rest of my life. In her papers, I found a card with Helen Park's name and number, paper clipped to a note in my mother's handwriting that said, "Call Helen first, before anything else is decided." I noted this and put it aside. I did not call Helen that night because the night was full of other things, and because I trusted my mother's timing and her sense of sequence. Marcus arrived Friday afternoon. He had rented a car at the airport, which was a choice that told me things, because the house I grew up in was 20 minutes from the airport, and I had a car and he had my number. He came with his wife Stephanie, who is pleasant in the uncomplicated way of someone who has never been required by circumstances to be more than pleasant. They came into the house, the key I had given them, my key, the one I had been using for 20 years. And Marcus walked through the rooms in the way you walk through a space you are evaluating rather than inhabiting. He said, "We should talk about the estate." He said it within 2 hours of arriving. "I want you to hold that." Our mother had been dead for 31 hours. I said, "I've left a message for her attorney. We should wait to hear from her before we make any decisions." He said, "I've already spoken to the estate attorney." I said, "I left a message for Helen Park." She was Mom's attorney. He said, "That's not the estate attorney." He said it in the tone of someone correcting a minor factual error. Patient, slightly tired of the error. The estate is handled by Gerald Moss, who I've already been in contact with. I had never heard the name Gerald Moss. My mother had not mentioned a Gerald Moss. I had found Helen Park's card in my mother's own papers, in her own handwriting, with a note that said, "Call Helen first." I said, "Where did you get Gerald Moss's name?" Marcus said he had found paperwork. He did not specify when or where. He said the estate was straightforward and he was named executor, and he wanted to move through this efficiently for everyone's sake. For everyone's sake. As though efficiency were a form of care. I said, "I'd like to see that paperwork." He said he'd have Gerald send something over. He said it in the way people say things they do not intend to follow through on immediately, a deferral dressed as a promise. Then he went to make phone calls, and Stephanie made tea, and I sat in my mother's kitchen and looked at the card with Helen Park's number and thought about the note that said, "Call Helen first." I called Helen first. She answered. It was a Friday evening and she answered, which told me she had been expecting the call. Her voice had the quality of someone who is professionally calm in circumstances that other people find overwhelming, which is the highest compliment I can give to a person in her position. She said she was sorry for my loss. She said she had been expecting to hear from me. She said, "Your mother told me you would call within the first day or two, and she told me what to tell you when you did." She said, "Don't let your brother move faster than you can track. Come to my office Monday morning. Bring anything you can find in your mother's files. And don't sign anything before you come." I said, "Marcus says there's another attorney, Gerald Moss." There was a brief silence. Then Helen said, "Gerald Moss handled the first will. I handled the second one." She paused. "Your mother revised her estate documents 4 months ago. I prepared and witnessed the revised documents. They supersede everything Gerald Moss has." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Does Marcus know about the revision?" "He does not," Helen said. "Your mother's instructions were specific on this point. She wanted the revised documents presented at the reading, with all parties present, at which time everything would be explained." She looked at her options carefully. Diane. She was very deliberate about the order she wanted this done in. I thanked her. I hung up. I looked at my mother's kitchen, the arrangement of her things, the coffee mugs in the order she kept them, the particular organization of a woman who thought about where things lived and put them there deliberately. She had thought about this deliberately. She had sat with Helen Park 4 months before she died, while she was still well enough to be precise, and she had built a structure that would hold until it was needed. She had written a note and put Helen's card in her papers and said, "Call Helen first," because she had known exactly what was coming. She had known Marcus, and she had known herself, and she had known me. And she had put something in place that was as much a final act of mothering as anything she had ever done for me. I did not cry that night, for the first time since Thursday morning. I made dinner. I looked at Helen Park's number on the card. I thought about my mother sitting across a conference table from a woman she trusted and saying, "Make sure Diane gets this herself, by hand, in person, not through Marcus." She had known. Saturday and Sunday were the architecture of a confrontation that hadn't yet happened. Marcus arranged the funeral without consulting me. He called the funeral home my mother had not specified and arranged a service that was private, family only, in the specific definition of family that he announced on Sunday evening. Himself, Stephanie, 2 cousins who had been close to him in childhood and less close to our mother and our mother's sister Vera, who lived 3 hours away, and who I had been the one to call on Thursday, and who had driven down Friday, and who was staying at the house and who was watching Marcus's management of this situation with an expression I recognized as Vera's version of extreme displeasure held under controlled conditions. I was not on the list. On Saturday morning, I had driven to the house, out of habit as much as intention, the drive I had made so many times that my hands knew the route without instruction, and found the lock changed. I stood on the porch and knocked. Stephanie answered. She had the look of someone who had been given a script she was not entirely comfortable delivering. She said Marcus was handling the arrangements and that the service was going to be private and that they would be in touch. She said this without meeting my eyes for the full duration of any of the sentences. I asked to speak to Marcus. She went to get him. There was a pause long enough that I understood he was deciding whether to come to the door, which told me everything about the Sunday conversation that was still coming. He came. He stood in the doorway the way I described at the beginning of this story. Arms crossed, the expression of a man who has decided something and is prepared to hold the position. And he said what he said. Mom's wishes were clear. "You're not in the will. You're not part of this. I want to tell you what it feels like to be told by your brother that you are not family enough to attend your mother's funeral." I have tried to find the accurate language for this, and I keep arriving at the same word: erasure. Not anger, not grief, not betrayal, though all of those were present. Erasure is the right word. The experience of being told that the 20 years, the medications, the appointments, the nights, the phone calls, the presents, that none of it counted as belonging to this woman. That belonging was something Marcus got to define and distribute, that I was outside the definition because he said so. I said, "Be very careful, Marcus." Quietly, not as a threat. As a statement about the nature of what was about to happen, which I could feel the shape of without yet being able to see it completely. He closed the door. He believed himself. I want to be precise about that. He was not performing cruelty. He had spoken to Gerald Moss, and Gerald Moss had shown him a document, and Marcus had read it and absorbed it as truth, and built a position on it, quickly and completely, the way he built positions on information in his career, decisively, without revisiting. He had not asked whether there was more. It had not occurred to him to ask, because the document he had said what he needed it to say, and he had stopped looking. I sat in my car for perhaps 20 minutes. Helen Park called. I drove home. Sunday, I did not go to the service. I did not attend my mother's funeral. I want you to hold that. I sat in my apartment 20 minutes away while a service was conducted without me for a woman I had spent 20 years beside, in a church she had attended every week, with flowers that were not chosen by the person who knew her best, and a program that did not contain my name and eulogies that did not include my voice. Vera called me from the parking lot after, still in her funeral clothes. She told me what she had seen and what she had heard. She said, specifically, "Your mother would have hated this." She meant the management of it. She meant the organized exclusion at the center of a day that had been built around the wrong accounting of who this woman was to her children. I thanked Vera. I sat. I made tea I didn't drink. I looked at Helen Park's number and I thought about my mother in November, sitting across a conference table from a woman she trusted, saying words I was only now understanding the full weight of. Make sure Diane gets this herself. By hand, in person. Not through Marcus. She had known this Sunday would come. She had known this precise shape of it. The lock, the list, the private service, the man who moves fast and doesn't check whether there is more. She had known because she knew Marcus, the way a mother knows the particular mechanisms of a person she has watched for 45 years. And she had built, 4 months earlier, a structure that would hold exactly until Monday morning. Pause. Because this is the moment I want you to sit with before we go to Monday morning, eh? The moment in the apartment, alone while a service happened without me for a woman I had driven to chemotherapy for 11 months. Have you ever been present for something, truly, consistently, in the way that costs you time and energy and the other paths you might have taken? And had someone look at all of that presence and act as though it didn't count? As though the showing up didn't accumulate into something that mattered? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Because the thing about being the one who stays is that staying is invisible in the way that dramatic gestures never are. And the people who make the dramatic gestures often end up with more credit than the people who made the coffee and learned the medication schedule and sat with the nights that were hard. Subscribe, because Monday morning is coming. And Helen Park had a second envelope, and Marcus was about to discover that his mother had known exactly what she was doing. Monday morning, Helen Park's office was in a building downtown 3rd floor, the kind of space that is deliberately modest for what it does. Clean, quiet, functional, with the particular organization of someone who finds disorder disrespectful to the work. She met me at the door. She was perhaps 55, direct in the way I find immediately trustworthy, with the specific composed energy of someone who has sat in rooms with grieving families for decades and has learned to be the steadiest thing in the room. She had called Marcus. I want to tell you how she had framed this. She had sent a formal notice through Gerald Moss's office that a reading of the estate documents would take place Monday morning at 10 and that all interested parties were required to be present. She had done this Friday evening, after our call. She had given Gerald Moss's office 48 hours. She had been scrupulous about procedure. Marcus arrived 7 minutes late, which told me everything about his understanding of the balance of power in the room. You arrive late to meetings you believe you're running. He came in with Stephanie and with Gerald Moss, who was a man of perhaps 65 with a prosperous, settled quality that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person present. He was not today the most important person present. Marcus looked at me in the way of someone who had not expected me to be there and who found my presence an irritant he would deal with after the main business was concluded. He sat down. Gerald Moss sat down. Helen Park sat down across from them with a folder in front of her that she did not immediately open. She introduced herself. She stated her firm's name and her relationship to the estate. She said, "I prepared the estate documents for Margaret, my mother's name, 4 months prior to her death. These documents were executed in full compliance with all applicable requirements, witnessed by 2 independent witnesses and notarized. They supersede all prior estate documents." She looked at Gerald Moss specifically when she said supersede. He was very still. Marcus said, "My mother's estate was handled by Gerald Moss." He said it with the confidence of someone who has not yet understood the shape of the room. Helen said, "Your mother retained Gerald Moss for her initial estate planning, yes. She retained this firm for the revised documents, which she executed in November." She opened the folder. She had her reasons for the revision, which will be clear from the documents themselves and from the letter she asked me to deliver today. She reached into the folder and placed 2 envelopes on the table. One was addressed to Marcus, one was addressed to me. Both were in my mother's handwriting. The careful, upright hand I had read on birthday cards and grocery lists and the notes she left on the counter when she went to bed before I arrived. Marcus looked at the envelopes. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen there before. Something that was not yet understanding, but was the beginning of the territory where understanding lives. Helen said, "I'll give you each a moment with these before we proceed to the documents. I will not tell you everything my mother wrote to me in that letter. Some of it is mine and will remain so. But I will tell you what she said at the beginning and what she said at the end, because those parts belong to the story. At the beginning, she wrote, 'I know you never asked credit. That is one of the things I have always loved about you, and one of the things I have sometimes failed to honor properly. I am honoring it now, in the way available to me, which is imperfect and late and the best I can do.' At the end, she wrote, 'The house is yours because you made it a home for longer than anyone else. The rest is yours because you earned it in the way that quiet people earn things, without anyone keeping score.' And I was keeping score, Diane. I always was. I just didn't always show it the way I should have. I folded the letter. I put it in my bag. I looked at the window. Across the table, Marcus had finished reading his letter and had placed it on the table in front of him. He was very still. Stephanie had put her hand on his arm. He was not responding to the hand. Helen proceeded to the documents, the house, the family home, the one with the new lock Marcus had installed on Saturday morning, the one I had grown up in and had driven to and from for 20 years, came to me outright. Not divided, not shared, not subject to buyout provisions. To me, in full. The financial assets were divided, 60% to me and 40% to Marcus, which reversed the proportions of the original will Gerald Moss was holding. There was a small account set aside specifically for Vera, my mother's sister, which my mother had noted was because Vera had been a true friend through hard years and deserved acknowledgement of her own. Vera, who had watched Marcus manage the last 3 days with her particular expression of controlled displeasure, received this information with the specific composure of someone who had known it was coming and was not surprised. There was also a personal property designation, a separate document, 2 pages in my mother's careful typewritten hand with handwritten annotations in the margins that listed specific objects and who she wanted to have them, and in several cases, a brief sentence about why. I will tell you only that the entries were not sentimental in the greeting card sense, and that they were very specifically her, and that reading them while sitting across a conference table from my brother was the most I had cried since Thursday morning. Gerald Moss attempted once to raise a procedural question about the timing of the revision. Helen Park addressed it in 2 sentences with such complete and unhurried precision that he did not raise another one. He did not attempt a 3rd question. He sat with his hands flat on the table and the look of a man who has understood that the room is not the room he thought it was. Marcus said nothing throughout the reading. This is the detail I keep returning to when I think about that morning. He did not protest, did not contest, did not turn the disbelief into an argument. He sat in the chair with his letter in front of him, and he was very quiet in a way I had not seen him be quiet before, in all the years I had known him. It was not the quiet of someone absorbing a shock. It was the quiet of someone reading, belatedly, a document they should have understood far earlier. The document of what their absences had actually meant, written finally in language they could not argue with. Stephanie had put her hand on his arm partway through, and he had not responded to it. Just sat with it resting there the way you sit with something you cannot currently process. After Helen finished, she asked whether there were questions. Marcus said, "When was she?" He stopped, started differently. He said, 4 months ago. She was still well in November. Yes, Helen said. He said, "She didn't tell me." No, Helen said. She did not. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "She told Diane." Helen said, "She told Diane what she needed to know to reach out after the documents were in place. The documents themselves she kept private until today, as is the standard practice." He looked at me for the first time since sitting down. Not with anger, with something harder to name and, I think, harder to feel. The specific complicated expression of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of something they thought they already understood. He had come into this room confident in a version of the story that his mother had allowed him to hold, privately, carefully, right up until the moment when allowing it was no longer possible. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I had prepared things to say, in the way you prepare things in the days between the injustice and its resolution. In the moment, none of them seemed necessary. The room had already said what needed saying. My mother had said it in November, in the same building, to a woman with Helen Park's composure, and it was being said again on her behalf. I had nothing to add. Here is what happened after we left the office. Vera caught up with me on the sidewalk outside, moving faster than a woman of 67 has any obligation to move. She took my arm. She said, "Your mother told me in October that she was doing this. She said she wanted me to know so someone who loved you both would be in the room on the day." I said, "Did you know about the funeral?" She said, "Marcus told me Sunday night. I told him he was making a mistake." She paused. "He told me Mom's wishes were clear." I said, "He believed that." She said, "He believed what was convenient." She looked at me. "Your mother used to say you were the one who saw things accurately, even when the accurate version was uncomfortable." She said she wished she'd told you that more often. I stood on the sidewalk outside a lawyer's office holding a letter from my dead mother, and I let myself feel the full weight of that sentence and what it contained, and what it would have meant to hear it earlier, and what it meant to hear it now. Imperfect and late and the best that was available. Vera walked me to my car. She held my hand for a moment before she let go. She said, "Go home." And she meant it the way my mother would have meant it. Marcus called me 2 weeks later. I had been in the house by then. My house with the lock changed back, which I had done myself on Monday afternoon because I know how to change a lock, and because doing it myself felt correct. I had been sleeping in my old room and would be until I decided what I wanted to do with the space. The house needed to simply be the house for a while, to breathe in its own particular way before becoming anything else. My mother had lived in it for 30 years. It deserved a period of just being itself. I had been going through her things slowly, without agenda. Some people sort quickly because the grief of being among the objects is too much. I found the opposite. Being among her things was the closest thing available to being near her. I found the shoebox of receipts organized by year. I found on her desk a photograph of the two of us from perhaps 15 years ago at a restaurant, which I don't remember taking, in which she is looking at me while I'm talking with an expression I had never seen directed at me when I was present and conscious of being seen. It is the expression of someone watching someone they are proud of. She never showed me that face directly. She left me the photograph instead. He called on a Thursday evening. I answered. He said, "I want to understand what I missed. Not, I'm sorry. Not yet." That came later, in pieces, over months, in the fragmented way that real accountability arrives when it is not being performed. But this question, "I want to understand what I missed," was the most honest thing Marcus had said to me in years. It acknowledged the shape of something without yet being able to name all of it. I told him some of it, not all. I was not yet ready to give him the full version, and some parts of 20 years of presence are not transferable by description anyway. They are only available through having been there, which is the definition of the problem. But I told him the structure, the chemotherapy, the medication schedule, the nights, the appointment driving, the October when she had gotten very organized about her final arrangements, the Helen Park card in her papers, the note. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "She knew I would move fast." "Yes," I said. He said, "She set it up so that moving fast wouldn't work." "She did," I said. He said, "She protected you." I said, "She protected both of us in the way she knew how." She protected you from doing something you couldn't undo before someone could stop you. She protected me from having to fight for what was mine without backup. She thought it through, Marcus. The way she thought everything through. She was just more private about this one than usual. He was quiet again. Then, she was always smarter than both of us. She was, I said. And I meant it the way I had always meant it. As admiration, not diminishment. She was the smartest person in most rooms she entered, and she was too polite to make it obvious and too strategic to let you forget it. He laughed slightly, the complicated laugh of someone sitting at the junction of several feelings at once. He said, before we hung up, I shouldn't have changed the lock. No, I said. He said, I was afraid of what was in the will. I know, I said. He said, I thought if I moved first. I know, I said again. She knew too. She accounted for it. There was a pause. Then, very quietly, she always accounted for everything. She did, I said. She just didn't always let us see her doing it. I sat in the kitchen after we hung up, with her coffee mugs in their order and the photograph on the counter, and I felt the particular grief that had been waiting under everything else. Not the anger, not the exhaustion, not the long wearing weeks of managing and showing up. Just the clean fact of missing her. The person. The woman who had organized her love into a folder with a second envelope and notes in the margins about why each object belonged where it was going. She had been keeping score, all of those years. She just hadn't shown me the ledger until she had to. Here is where we are now. Marcus and I are in the early stages of something I don't yet have a name for. Not reconciliation exactly. Reconciliation implies a prior closeness that we never quite had. Something more like a renegotiated understanding of who we are to each other, built on a more accurate accounting of what each of us has been. We talk roughly once a month. The conversations are not easy and are not performed and are more honest than any we had when our mother was alive to absorb the space between us. He came to the house in June, the first time since the Monday of the reading. He stood in the doorway and looked at it differently than he had in February. Differently in the specific way of someone seeing something for the first time even though they have seen it before, because the understanding has changed and the understanding changes what you see. He said, "You did a lot here." I said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't see it." I said, "I know." He said, "I see it now." I said, "Good." He stayed for 2 hours. We had coffee in the kitchen. Her mugs in her order because I had not moved them and did not intend to. And we talked about our mother. Not about the estate or the will or the law or the list or the document Marcus had built his position on. We talked about her. The way she kept the mugs. The expression she made when she was trying not to laugh at something she thought she shouldn't find funny. A very specific expression that required keeping her mouth entirely still while her eyes did the laughing. The way she had told the same story about the time a bat got into the house in 1996 at least 15 times, and each time it was slightly more chaotic than the last. The way she had loved Marcus with a helpless ferocity, and loved me with a different depth that was harder to see and harder to describe. Marcus told me something at that kitchen table that I did not expect. He said he had found a box in the study. My study now, though I am still adjusting to this. A box of letters. Letters he had written her from school. Every letter. From the age of 12, when he first went to summer camp, through his 20s, when he still wrote actual letters because our mother had made it clear she preferred them to calls. She had kept every single one, organized chronologically, rubber-banded by year. He said finding them had undone him in a way the reading had not, because the reading was about documents and the box was about her. About who she was when she was keeping things. About the specific care of a woman who collected evidence of the people she loved and organized it by year. "I know about the box," I said. "I found it when I was going through the study." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Did she keep yours too?" "There's a separate box," I said. "Mine are in a different one." He absorbed that. Then, "She kept both." "She kept both," I said. We sat there for a while with that. Two people in a kitchen, children of the same woman, holding the evidence of how they had been loved in ways they had not always been able to see clearly while it was happening. I asked him if he wanted to see his box. He said yes. I got it from the study and put it on the table between us. He didn't open it right away. He put both hands on top of it and looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something that is too large to absorb all at once. Then he said, "She was a remarkable woman." "Yes?" I said. She was. He said, I should have been here more. I know, I said. And I said it without anger, which surprised me a little. The anger had gone somewhere in the time between the Sunday and the reading and the months of careful phone calls and the June afternoon in the kitchen. It had not disappeared. I think grief anger doesn't disappear. It changes form. But it had become something I was no longer required to carry in the front of every thought. It had moved to a place where it was true without being the first thing. He took the box with him when he left. He called me the following week to tell me he had read through some of the letters and they had kept him up most of the night. He said, I wrote her a lot of letters. She responded to all of them. I said, I know. She told me. He said, she never told me she kept them. I said, she wouldn't have. That wasn't how she showed things. He said, how did she show things? I thought about it. Then, she showed up, I said. In the ways available to her, in the forms that fit her, she showed up. She was not a woman who advertised her love. She documented it. There was a pause. Then Marcus said, in a voice that had something different in it, she documented yours differently. Yes, I said. She did. And I knew that sentence cost him something to say, and I received it in the way it was offered, as an acknowledgement that was also an apology in a form he could manage at that stage of the process, not a complete one. The complete version came later, in pieces, in the way that real things arrive. But it was the beginning. And beginnings in the years I have been alive have always been the part that matters. Here is where we are now. Marcus and I talk roughly once a month. The conversations are not easy and are not performed and are more honest than any we had when our mother was alive to absorb the space between us. We are in the early stages of something I don't yet have a full name for. Not reconciliation, which implies a prior closeness we never quite had. Something more like a renegotiated understanding of who we are to each other, built on a more accurate accounting of what each of us has been and what we each cost the other, and what our mother saw when she looked at both of us. Vera comes to visit every few months. She stays in the house, in the guest room, and we have the conversations that my mother would have been glad we were having. Honest ones, unhurried, over the kitchen table with her mugs in their order. Vera knew my mother longer than anyone alive, and she tells me things I didn't know. Small things, stories from before I was born or when I was too young to remember. Things that fill in the picture of a woman I thought I knew completely, and keep discovering I knew only partially, which is the nature of knowing people, that they are always larger than the version of them you hold. The house is becoming itself again. I have changed very little, which has surprised people who expected me to renovate, to stamp ownership on it, to make it visibly mine. But it is already visibly mine. It was mine in ways that were always true and that a document simply confirmed. What I am doing is living in it, which is the most accurate form of ownership. I sit on the front porch in the mornings with coffee. I have repaired the gutter on the north side that my mother had not mentioned, but that I noticed the second week I was there. I have kept the coffee mugs in their order. I am not a woman who deals in tragedy. I am a woman who drives where she needs to go and learns what she needs to know and stays when staying is required. That is not heroism. That is not even virtue exactly. It is a choice made repeatedly over 20 years, in ordinary light, without ceremony. My mother saw it. She was keeping score. She left me the house and the letter and the knowledge that the most private forms of love are not always the least real ones. Sometimes they are the most real. The ones that survive because they were never dependent on being seen. The ones that a precise woman puts on paper in November when she knows what is coming and wants to make sure the right person has what they need when it arrives. She was right about what she knew. She was right about the order of things. She was right about Helen Park and the second envelope and the particular kind of protection that a precise woman puts in place when she knows the people she loves and knows what is going to happen after she is gone. She saw me. She was keeping score. And she made sure that what she had been keeping, privately and accurately for 41 years, went on record in the only way that couldn't be managed or redirected or revised downward by a man who had confused his own confidence for her wishes. She left me the house. She left me the letter. She left me the knowledge that I was seen, which is the one thing that presence ultimately asks for and rarely, until the end, receives. She also left me something I did not expect and had not prepared for, which was a version of Marcus I had not known was possible. The man who sat across from me in June with his hands on a box of letters was not the man who changed the lock. He was someone further along in the process of understanding something. Someone who was willing to sit with the discomfort of what he had missed and let it teach him rather than defending himself against it. That is not a small thing. I have known many people who received that kind of information and spent the rest of their lives arguing with it instead. Marcus chose, imperfectly and gradually, not to argue. He chose to understand rather than to defend. I did not think him capable of that choice. I am glad to have been wrong about it. Being wrong about a person in the direction of their being better than you expected is the best kind of wrong there is. My mother knew. She knew Marcus, and she knew me, and she knew what each of us needed and what each of us was capable of. And she built a structure that would produce the version of events she wanted to produce. She chose the right attorney. She wrote the right letters. She put the right card in the right place in her papers and wrote a note that said, "Call Helen first." She was not a woman who left things to chance when she could build something instead. She built something. It held. Here is what I want to leave you with. If you are the one who stays, the one who drives, who shows up, who learns the schedule, who sits with the nights, I want you to hear this clearly. What you are doing is not invisible, even when it feels invisible. Even when the people who show up dramatically receive more acknowledgement than you receive for showing up continuously. Even when the brother who calls on Sundays gets the place at the table that your 20 years of presence hasn't secured. It is not invisible. Some people are keeping score who have not told you so. And some of those people, in their most private and deliberate moments, will put what they have been keeping somewhere it cannot be misplaced or overridden. It is also possible that no second envelope exists for you. I am not going to tell you this story guarantees one. What I am going to tell you is that the life you build in the years you spend being present is not contingent on the envelope. The medications you learn and the appointments you drive and the nights you sit through, those are not debts waiting to be paid. They are the shape of who you are. They are what you chose to do with your time when the choice was available to you. My mother chose to make it official. She chose to put it on paper in a room with Helen Park and say, "Make sure Diane gets this herself. By hand. In person. Not through Marcus." She knew me well enough to know what I needed and precise enough to deliver it in the form that would hold. I was there for the end of her life. She was there for the beginning of the rest of mine. That's my story. A second envelope. A daughter who stayed and a mother who saw her and an attorney who answered the phone on a Friday evening because she had been expecting the call. If this landed somewhere true for you today, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. Leave me a comment. Subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge. And know that being the one who stays is not nothing. It never was.